I'm Joanne Miller from Apple Farm, and this is the Red Book Reading Group with Apple Farm Community and Kavala Retreat. Jo Marie from Kavala will guide the group tonight. So I would just say, if it's comfortable for you, if you would mute and unmute when you want to speak. I didn't mention last time, but both Kavala and Apple Farm exist out of the goodness of people's hearts and their contribution. So if you would care to contribute at any point to either of the places for part of this Red Book experience, please know that is helpful and useful. So Jo Marie, I think I'll hand it to you.
Sounds good. I don't know, does anyone want to drop the donation page for Apple Farm into the chat? Maybe, or Joanne can do that. Yeah, and then also if there's anybody here who doesn't get the Apple Farm newsletter and you want a reminder for registration from me, feel free to just drop your email in the chat. And if you're already getting those from me, you don't need to put your email in there. But if you're not, if you kind of fall in between the cracks, you're not getting info from me or Apple Farm, just put your email in. So we'll get that. And I'm just going to make a reminder right at the beginning that the next group is March 23rd. So it's the fourth Thursday of every month at 6:30. And the assignment for that one is Liber Secundus Chapters 4 to 12. And just no need to raise hands or anything. Anytime someone wants to speak, just unmute and start talking. So you're good to go. And Mary can't be with us tonight. She did a great job of covering a whole bunch of the first book, Liber Primus, and I was just going to do like a 5-minute really quick narrative thread recap of that just so we kind of know where we are in the book. I've got a second screen kind of above this one, so if I look like I'm looking away, I'm just looking at another screen. So we started with Liber Primus with the prologue, or the way of what is to come. And it kind of set the stage for things with Jung's visions of destruction and, his sense of impending doom around the world wars coming. The first chapter and the second were around soul, so refinding the soul and God. And some of the themes from those were that one must live life and really live life, and the motif of the divine child, so the soul as child. And just to keep that soul as child in mind too, because those images of his soul change throughout the book. And I find it kind of nice to track like where that soul image is landing. It helps me to kind of flesh out what he's talking about when he talks about soul. From there, he goes into the chapter of service of the soul, and the focus is disorder and meaninglessness, and kind of that beginning of the descent into shadow for him. At that point, the soul image becomes one of the desert. So after divine child, we kind of go to the soul as desert, and the motifs of waiting, of shame, of scorn. So we're really starting to descend into that more shadow material, enduring aridness and infertility in order to find creative forces. From there, we go right into descent into hell. So the themes are divine madness in the next chapter and the desert blooming. And that's where we start to get just this like sort of river of archetypal symbols. And we find the slain hero, a black beetle, a new sun, a shining red crystal, a river of death. So this is where archetypal images and symbols are really sort of blooming to life out of that aridity. The next chapter is splitting of the spirit, and that's the theme in that is becoming hell, so the self becoming hell. And then we get to the murder of the hero, which is that first sort of major plot theme that happens where Jung is slaying the hero, and some of the interpretations around that he made were the slaying of the superior function, so his thinking function, and which allows him to encounter his shadow more fully. I've been listening to the Salome lectures. I'll drop a link in the chat for those as well. They're really amazing. They started during 2020 during lockdown for COVID, and really do an amazing job of looking, chapter by chapter at the Red Book and connecting it with social justice, with societal themes, with collective themes and personal themes. So if anyone wants to follow those, I would highly recommend them. Did you see? Oh, whoops! I got her. Ruth is waiting to come in. So yeah, in that sacrifice of the hero, murder of the hero, we have themes of death and rebirth, the necessity of sacrifice, that sort of thing. And then the last one we covered last time was the conception of God. And I just wanted to retouch on some of those themes really quickly that feel really important for the last 3 chapters of Liber Primus. And one is to take pains to awaken the dead. The other is ambiguity. The third is the God within. And the fourth is solitude. And some of those, particularly ambiguity and solitude, I just want to really highlight for the Buddhists here to track those themes as well as we move through the Red Book, because I think you'll find a lot of correspondences with Buddhist practice. So ambiguity, the middle way, not going to one extreme or the other, solitude or viveka in the Buddhist teachings. I think tracking those through the Red Book has been super helpful for me to connect things up with Buddhist practice. And let me just read just a couple quotes from there. So this is about the dead, bringing the dead back to life. And he says, we cannot slay death as we have already taken all of life from it. If we still want to overcome death, then we must enliven it. Another note to Buddhists, because as all the Buddhists present know, that overcoming of death is a super important theme in Buddhism. So therefore, on your journey, be sure to take golden cups full of the sweet drink of life, red wine, and give it to dead matter so that it can win life back. The dead matter will change into black serpents. Do not be frightened. The serpents will immediately put out the sun of your days, and a night with wonderful will-o'-the-wisps will come over you. So that in itself is, I think, a really good example of the ambiguity of his journey and what he documented here, that the life is going into the death and taking that life into the places that are in shadow within us. So take pains to awaken the dead, dig deep mines, and throw in sacrificial gifts so that they reach the dead. And I love that paragraph. It's just kind of an intro to his real confrontation with the opposites. On ambiguity, he says, but ambiguity is the way of life. If the left foot does not move, then the right one does, and you move. The God wills this. What is more ambiguous than love? Love is the way of life, but your love is only on the way of life if you have a left and a right.
Jo Marie, what pages are those from?
Oh, I'm sorry, 169. These are all from 169 to 173. The ambiguity one was on 170. The God within is on 172. And he says, if we set a God outside of ourselves, he tears us loose from the self. Since the God is more powerful than we are, our self falls into privation. But if the God moves into the self, he snatches us from what is outside us. We arrive at singleness in ourselves. So the God becomes communal in reference to what is outside us, but single in relation to us. No one has my God, but my God has everyone, including myself. Buddhists, another head up there, although that kind of smacks of Mahayana Buddhism, maybe. No one has my God, but my God has everyone, including myself. The gods of all individual men always have all other men, including myself. So it is always the one God, despite his multiplicity. So again, that ambiguity of singularity and multiplicity. And then solitude on page 173. We should become reconciled to solitude in ourselves and to the God outside of us. If we enter into this solitude, then the life of the God begins. If we are in ourselves, then the space around us is free, but filled by the God. So that's just kind of a summary of where we left off. Any comments before we kind of get into the meat of things? The chapter we're starting with is Mysterium Encounter, where he really encounters Salome and Elijah and the serpent. And the motifs here are the prophet. The Salome lectures have a super wonderful question to accompany that. And what Satya Bayak asked is, what does it take to listen to the inner wisdom? So that prophet motif as inner wisdom. And then the blind feminine. And between those two, again, there's that motive, or that that theme of living your own mystery. And there was something else that Satya Bayak mentioned in the Salome lectures that I thought was really important. And she says, descent is not the journey of initiation for everyone. From a psychological perspective, continued going down into the depths is not always the necessity. And I think she adds that it can actually be death for some people. So again, I think that real importance of, she's connecting it with a lot of the collective dynamics happening today around racism, oppression, misogyny, violence, those sorts of things. And for some people, and she's an analyst, going into further into those depths is not what's necessary, but going more to the transcendent would be, is what she finds with some people is what's necessary. So just to really highlight that going into this, because I know a lot of us have done a lot of diving deep into the depths, and just to be aware that it's, again, the mystery is one's own. And on page 178 is a nice quote about that. He says, my mysteries are inviolable. They belong to me and cannot belong to you, your own. So I think as we go into this, and he's going to underline that too around his critiques around what may have happened within Christianity over time around Christ's unconscious material being taken as the one and only pathway, and that can be kind of a killing function in some ways. And then the last quote for right here before I open it up to everyone is about the blind feminine symbol. It really intrigues me. I don't know if that intrigues other people, but I haven't ever been able to fully kind of bring it to life for myself. I know it's occurred in my dreams. It may have occurred in other people's dreams too. It's a common theme you might see in movies. I think of the Green Knight had a really prominent blind feminine scene in it. It was just beautiful, actually. And let me find. It says, this also includes the snake. In myths, the snake is a frequent counterpart of the hero. There are numerous accounts of their affinity. Therefore, the presence of the snake was an indication of a hero myth. Salome is an anima figure, blind, because though connecting the conscious and the unconscious, she does not see the operation of the unconscious. Elijah is the personification of the cognitional element, Salome of the erotic or the connecting. So those are some things that stood out to me in that chapter around motifs and material that he's working with that I felt pretty drawn to. And I'm just curious to know what popped out for others.
I'm not sure where you read that little definition just now, Joe. It doesn't matter on Eros, but it's real. There's a real clear definition of logos and eros. If we want it in the footnote on 178, so it'd be footnote 161. I guess the very end of it, and where it says by logos I meant discrimination, judgment, insight, and by eros I meant the placing into relation. Very close to what you just said, but really simple and concise.
Thank you. Yeah, what the little bit I read was from the previous page, just higher up, I think, in that same footnote.
And by relation, I think it's important to recognize its relation both to the feeling realm as well as to relationships themselves. So there's a dual component to that. Whereas you think of these things, he ascribes to logos as being more of an individual assent kind of structure.
Nice, thank you.
I'm wondering, Don just made that gesture with his hand, logos up and down, and then does Eros then create the balance of the cross by going horizontally? I don't know.
I wonder if people are, as we're going through this, if people are sort of their superior function is kind of popping up for them, and you're finding ways that your inferior function may be calling to you. So I'm going to look at a couple. Did anyone else want to say something about that chapter?
Excuse me. Just on page 183, following the kind of narrative thread that you were laying out for the previous chapters, I thought that realization, it's in the on 183 where it starts, in the garden it had become apparent to me that I love Salome. This recognition struck me since I had not thought it. And then he goes on, what a thinker does not think, he believes does not exist. What one does not feel, and what one who feels does not feel, he believes does not exist. And then on from there, you begin to have a presentiment of the whole when you embrace your opposite principle, since the whole belongs to both principles, which grow into one root. So the recognition that he loved Salome, who is Eros, who can be standing in as Eros itself, seems to be indication that he's accepting, the function of feeling, his minor function, and recognizing its value and its presence.
Yeah. I agree. That is a nice, sort of synopsis of that. And the wholeness, sort of that beckons from within that.
And that's a contrast to his initial horror, seeing her as this murderess. And when she said she loved him, he was horrified by that and felt threatened and contaminated by it. So here, when he admits that he loves her, I think it's quite an admission of humility, actually.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that theme is so important, Don, too, that humbling sense and humility and moving into the shame and the scorn. And yeah. There's an amazing little bit in the Salome lectures about the history of the image of Salome and how it relates to not just sort of this is one man who's kind of at the pinnacle of European male power. And they really point out the way the Salome myth itself got distorted as it was passed down through history. So I thought that was a really nice connection between the individual and the collective. I'm thinking I think it's in lecture 6, maybe lecture 5 in the Salome lectures. But that this young woman was really, she's become sort of the embodiment of evil in a lot of the myth. And just some people who study that myth maybe more can tell me if that's always true or if she's sometimes an image of wisdom. But that she was really between her parents, and forced into this role. It wasn't something she took on willingly. So it's kind of a re-imaging of her.
I'm still puzzling a little bit over this footnote at the bottom of page 177, where it's saying that Salome is an anima figure, blind because though connecting the conscious and the unconscious, she does not see the operation of the unconscious. But that's not said of Elijah, which seems to me, but yet the whole context seems to imply that either one is blind without the other. So just more of a question than anything there.
Anyone want to take that? I agree, Nancy. I hear you. I wonder if it has to do with him being masculine and Elijah's the function he identifies with. Although Elijah's not able to see into the unconscious either, right? Don, Joanne, somebody?
I think they represent somewhat different aspects of the experience of the unconscious. And they are linked. I think that's right. But for Jung as a masculine person, the anima would represent this bridge between consciousness and unconsciousness as the anima. So that's a central role. If this were a female writer and Elijah was an animus figure, then he might be that link between conscious and unconscious more. But for Jung, the anima is this, for him as a man, the anima is this connector between conscious and unconscious, the link, the bridge.
Thank you. So as we move on to the instruction chapter, there's a big focus on the reality of these inner figures and the reality of the symbols. And then we have another kind of influx of archetypal symbols. So again, the divine child, the golden red flame, the round altar, the serpent, the lion, any of those are really rich for, anyone who wants to follow up on the meaning of those symbols. I think it's kind of a rich line to take. We start to see at that point the transformation into the third thing through the confrontation of the opposites, although that'll happen a little bit more even in resolution. There's the beheading again of the thinking function. And just speaking to the reality of the symbols on page 187, Elijah says, you may call us symbols for the same reason that you can also call your fellow men symbols if you wish to, but we are just as real as your fellow men. You invalidate nothing and solve nothing by calling us symbols. You plunge me into terrible confusion. Do you wish to be real? That's Jung speaking. Elijah says, we are certainly what you call real. Here we are, and you have to accept us. The choice is yours. So he says, I am silent. Salome has removed herself. Uncertainly, I look around. Behind me, a high golden red flame burns on a round altar. The serpent has encircled the flame. And then it goes on from there with the narrative. So I think things are becoming more and more, taking on more and more of a lifelike reality for Jung at this point.
There's something in a footnote later on, 217, 218, I think maybe it is, where he says something like, the real is what works.
Oh, yeah.
I just love that. Like what you just were reading from. It's like, well, it might be like an imagination. It might be some thing I'm creating out of my own, like whatever, my magical mind. And it's helping me discover things, heal, do whatever. So it's working. So it's a real thing. I just really like that.
Yes. Yeah, me too.
Joe, one of the themes of Jung, one of the emphases that he repeated over and over is the simple truth that he believed the psyche is real. In other words, our imaginations create real things. And for Jung, they were as real as these tables and chairs we're sitting on. And he says modern people don't get that. They've learned to view the psyche as less substantial than the material world. And he thinks that's a great mistake.
And just piggybacking with that, I was so taken by his, I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but still in our section, but how he said to take seriously every unknown wanderer who personally inhabits the inner world, right? And then he meets the devil and he meets the destitute. And, you know, it's the same for us, these figures that inhabit our dreams or our active imagination, that they're real.
I love that line. Do you know where it is? Take seriously.
About the unknown wanderer.
Yeah.
I think it's 217.
Is it?
And then the devil too, you know how he says he's your devil after all. Well, that's the devil. Let's see here.
Yep, there I see it. They're at the bottom, the last.
Oh, yeah. Take seriously every unknown wanderer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That feels like maybe a piece of your calligraphy, Joanne, to put on the altar. This I learned in the Mysterium, to take seriously every unknown wanderer. That's lovely.
That's the passage that has the footnote that I was mentioning.
Mm-hmm. They are real because they are effectual. So back a little ways on 188. I'm looking for it. I'm not seeing it now though. It's maybe someone else knows where it is, but the note on yearning, your yearning leads to your path.
Yeah, I had that part underlined, I think.
Where is it?
It's at the top of 188, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for him, his, yearning and joy are, have been invested in his shadow, and it's just the figure of the devil for him. But I love what he comes to here. All too many do not want to know where their yearning is, because it would seem to them impossible or too distressing. And yet yearning is the way of life. If you do not acknowledge your yearning, then you do not follow yourself, but go on to foreign ways that others have indicated to you. You do not live your life but an alien one. And that's a passage I kind of want to challenge the Buddhists with as well, because there's so much about non-clinging and renunciation in Buddhism, and I don't know as much about Christianity. But it feels like an important piece of the ambiguity too, of how the path is actually trodden. And that, you know, sometimes it's precisely in the yearning or in the clinging where the path opens. And that's one of the things I love about the Red Book too.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I heard a Buddhist speak to that once, and I'm actually a Buddhist as well, but a teacher. I'm not a teacher. And he said it is not about not having desires, the attachment to the desire.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if, you know, it's not having the urge, but it's the attachment to the urge, which is the challenge. But I'm not going to go any deeper because I'm not skilled that way. But I don't know if that is in alignment with what you were saying or not.
Yeah, I think that's a really great line of inquiry, and how to distinguish and discriminate those.
Right. Yeah. So it's, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's a beautiful teaching in Buddhism that only occurs once in the suttas, but there's a kind of a classic cause and effect chain that's taught about how suffering arises from ignorance, and it goes through clinging and craving. And there's only one teaching where that gets continued, and the chain goes from suffering to faith, and then faith to joy, to equanimity, to joy, and on up to awakening. And so I think that's it's called transcendent dependent co-origination, and the usual teaching is just itself dependent co-origination. So I also think that speaks to how, like, living the life, treading the path of suffering and clinging actually ends up taking you all the way around to faith, to joy, equanimity. So there's a little connection for you Buddhists out there.
One thing I like about this page we're on is, well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't yearning for it as a Buddhist, yearning for peace and contentment, yearning to understand this book. You know, I mean, there's, as our friend, as David said, you know, I mean, it's how we yearn. But these words about foreign ways and apishness and whatnot, it reminds me of D.H. Lawrence spoke about the ready-made label of society, where, you know, we're so easily stamped with whatever the sign of the times or whatever it is, and we don't take a look inside. We don't like figure out who we are and what we can do and how we can live in life. And to do that is a challenge. You kind of go against the stream. So, you know, at the very end of one of these paragraphs, do you know why you cannot abandon apishness? For fear of loneliness and defeat. Because, yeah, it takes some courage. It takes some courage to get on the path, whatever that path is, if it's going against, like, kind of the ways of normalcy. Maybe that's not the right word, but the ways of just kind of like sleepwalking, following the current of society, which generally doesn't lead to awakening. Or individuation. Is that the right term? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to resolution. And in resolution, we see a very graphic battle of serpents on page 194. He says, so this is the third night for him, and a deep longing to continue experiencing the mysteries seizes me. The struggle between doubt and desire was great in me. So he finds himself standing on a steep ridge in a wasteland in a dazzling bright day. I'm going to kind of skip through this paragraph. Elijah stands on the heights above. On the dark side lies a big black serpent, on the bright side a white serpent. They thrust their heads towards each other, eager for battle. Elijah stands on the heights above them. The serpents pounce on one another, and a terrible wrestling ensues. So they fight, and he sees the black serpent pulls itself back again. The front part of its body has become white. And the same for the white serpent. Both serpents curl about themselves, one in light, the other in darkness. So this is a teaching that Elijah kind of leads him through, and is the real sort of that real image of the conjunction of the opposites and the tension of the opposites. And then he goes on to speak about the crucifixion, a phrase that's applied to that sometimes is the crux of things, which I really like. And then there's a kind of an initiation, what he terms initiation and deification as part of his process of this descent. And with regards to that, on page 197, he does talk a bit about the danger of inflation when one is deified during this process of descent and initiation. And he says, in this deification mystery, you make yourself into the vessel and are a vessel of creation in which the opposites reconcile. And oh gosh, I'm not finding, I thought it continued on to talk about how the danger of inflation is avoided through that sort of sacrifice of oneself on that, the inner crucifixion and the making of yourself into a vessel. But I'm sorry, I'm not putting my eyes on it right here.
It's kind of near the bottom of the note, number 211.
Is it? Yeah, I don't see the reference to inflation there. I thought it was there.
No,
I guess it's not.
no.
Oh. But what Don was speaking to about that capacity for humility and being humble and taking in the despised, I think is maybe part of that as well. And by inflation, does anyone at Apple Farm want to say what inflation is or the dangers of inflation as we're going through these kind of intense processes? I know I'm looking at you, Don. There's excuse me.
Feel free, Joanne. Well, encounters with powerful unconscious material, especially archetypal material, can be overwhelming, and it can overwhelm the ego and become a state of possession. And people get possessed by states of unconscious energy. And this is always a danger, and just in terms of psychotherapy, when you're working with somebody who has a lot of repressed material, and all of a sudden they start having either experiences or dreams that are overwhelming to them and just disrupts their life. So it takes a good deal of ego strength and humility to be exposed directly to this kind of unconscious material. And, having a good support system, being grounded in reality, knowing your limits, these are all really important prerequisites.
Thank you. That seems really important. And recognizing projection, that really comes through in this chapter as well. He says at the top of page 200, since men do not know that the conflict occurs inside themselves, they go mad and one lays the blame on the other. If one half of mankind is at fault, then every man is half at fault. But he does not see the conflict in his own soul, which is, however, the source of the outer disaster. So that there's the other side of the danger around these processes is projecting these contents onto the people around us, the nations around us, and inflicting violence on our loved ones or our enemies. If you are aggravated against your brother, think that you are aggravated against the brother in you, that is, against what in you is similar to your brother. And again, another helpful tool to guard against inflation. And then the final lines of this chapter, I think, are pretty important to set us up to go into Liber Secundus as well. He says, the mystery showed me in images, what I should afterward live. I did not possess any of these boons that the mystery showed me, for I still had to earn all of them. So Liber Primus kind of wraps up with this sense of he's been shown these mysteries, but it's still up to him to go out and live that. And then the following chapters sort of lead us through those encounters that Joanne started touching on there, with that he encounters the devil, he encounters the feminine and the banal, he encounters the lowly one or the destitute. And so all of those wonders that in the next the first 3 chapters of Liber Secundus, he's brought into direct confrontation with, and the need to really be with them. And I'm not if other people have details of those chapters they want to bring forward, I would really welcome it. I could bring some forward, but I feel like I've brought a lot of images sort of to the discussion there. So each of these chapters is so rich. But to just summarize them as sort of the encounters one after another with those aspects of his shadow that are so important. And I just sort of invite anyone to bring forward what they might have found in those chapters that is useful. Oh, and just one thing, the images of the airing that occurs as kind of an introduction to Liber Secundus is where he amplifies that thought that when Christianity goes wrong, it's been in the taking of one man's unconscious contents and path as the only one, and failing to take the steps oneself on the path. So I think that's sort of the key message of the images of the airing, which is just a couple or one page, I think, before Liber Secundus starts. But yeah, I'd love to just open it up, and if there's images or pieces of those 3 encounters he had at the beginning, I'd love to hear what spoke to other people. I wonder if anybody noticed the theme of waiting. I don't know about you, but it's been up in a lot of groups I've spoken with. It's including Apple Farm groups. That theme of waiting has been big. It feels big in the collective too.
And I also was so taken with the beginning of the dialogue there on 212, where the red one says, "Your waiting has called me."
Yes. Yeah. Oh, another beautiful line, right?
Yeah, Joe. Yeah, I had a question. When it talks about the unconscious in reference to Christ, is it referring to Christ and his unconscious? Was that?
Yeah, yes, that's my understanding. Yeah, that the story of Christ is in a way a kind of representation of one person's path, just like the Red Book is a representation of one person's containing the archetypal images.
So the unconsciousness of Christ as represented in the Bible?
Or his making conscious the contents of his unconscious, his process of making them conscious, which led him onto his very dramatic path. Or does that distinction make sense?
Well, as related to the Bible, I guess. There's not something else that, okay. I never got that myself out of the Bible in terms of, is this an entirely Jungian thing?
I would say that's a Jungian take, but Christians out there and whoever else wants to speak to that. It's probably not something you would hear in a church, but maybe are there Gnostic traditions?
Well, the idea of the unconscious itself is pretty recent, really. I mean, just for, I don't know, 18th century, something like that. So before that, there wasn't a concept of the unconscious. So this is all sort of modern psychological development of looking at the stories.
I would say that there's also a very interesting image of Christ as Adam, as universal, that does even date back to the biblical canon. There are echoes of this in some of it, which is a fascinating kind of turn, if you will, on who is this Christ figure. As transcendent or preceding even the physical manifestation. That's not speaking to the unconscious, of course, but it is a kind of universalizing of sorts that might meet some of this conversation about the unconsciousness, our meeting one another.
So Christ is viewed as an archetype?
I don't believe those words, of course, are in Scripture, but
I'm sorry.
But yes, there are ways in which I may identify some of that with that Christ as, well, later on in even the apocalyptic works, the Alpha and the Omega, there is something that is pervasive but also transcendent in this sacred one, this divine human one.
The sacrificial savior archetype, yeah. And I would add that in answer to Job, Jung makes the case that part of Christ's mission was to repair the damage that God had inflicted on Job. God's basically unconsciousness related to Job impelled him to send part of himself to redeem his relationship to humanity. So there's this background unconscious drama.
Thank you. I love those connections from both of you. Go ahead, Dawn. Sorry.
I was just thinking, Lee, I don't know where your question comes from exactly, but I know in my own experience of the church that there's a great deal of reticence to disrobe Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, from the divine because of the power dynamics involved in the identification of church leadership with this suprahuman presence. So if you have experienced yourself, I know I have, the church's fearfulness around understanding archetypes that move through cultures and different religions. I think in part it is a power struggle, if you will. That's part of how I think of it anyway. So when we speak of the Christ in the church, which is, of course, the church is so big and broad and different and differently manifested and understood around the world. I cannot possibly speak for the church, but I have had experience of the church being very fearful and trembling around anybody who tries to disrobe the divinity or feels the threat of that. In naming and identifying Jesus with an archetype seems to diminish for some people, not for me, but for some people in the Christian faith, that all-powerful nature and identification. Those are some thoughts for me.
Right. It could be considered heresy, right, by some.
And certainly, so Don, what about the deification of oneself in that way, right? That would be double heresy, it seems, like making that inner initiation. And
Yeah, that's really, I think, some of the radicality of some Jungian thought is that it really invites us to take up our own crosses and accept our path of incarnation as well. So that it's an ongoing process. It didn't just happen once and it's done for everybody. It's an ongoing invitation, terrifying as that is, that it is really the current task and the perennial task.
That's
one thing I saw. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thought I saw somewhere that Jung was a sort of Meister Eckhart was somebody that he studied or believed in terms of his sermons. Is that true? Does anybody know about that? No?
I don't know, but I'm sure it's true.
I think he was inspired by Eckhart and Jacob Boehme and some of these other mystical writers. Yeah.
That's one thing that inspires me about what I'm reading in this book is this bit we're talking about here. As in the Buddha Dharma, we're told that we're able to wake up. We're able to do what the Buddha did, so to speak. We're invited to find that inside. And to hear Jung speak of becoming like finding that Christ within and being allowed, like you were saying, Don, just like allowing that thing to be manifest within us is makes sense to me as a Buddhist. And I understand that's maybe not what the church wants. Maybe that's, like, as Don was saying, that's the DAWN was saying that's problematic with, with how the church functions. And to hear Jung speak of it in those terms was like kind of surprising to me. It's like, oh, and inspiring,
I also was thinking of the parallel with Buddhist thought around the capacity of each individual to, to pursue awakening. And the deification also is something very strong in Brahmanic Hinduism, too, the notion of, the self as a deity. And there are numerous practices to cultivate that as well. And so as disruptive as it may seem to be towards certain traditions within Christianity, there certainly are other religious traditions where it's, the self, the person themselves don't need to be saved by anyone other than themselves, although there may be in some cases a guru in the case of Brahmanic Hinduism, or the Sangha, the community of fellow believers that support someone on the path to God.
Thank you.
There's an old joke. If you're in New York City and you start running around saying, I feel godlike, they might lock you up. If you're in Mumbai and you start running around saying, I feel godlike, they say, what took you so long?
And there's a lot of reality to that joke too. I spent a lot of time in around people in ashrams in India who talked about becoming God themselves. So you're right, and they wonder why it's taking so long.
Term now escapes me, but in Eastern orthodoxies, there is this of Christianity. There are very explicit deification of the human, the sanctification of the human that may become God. And this is Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christian thought. Part of the divide between the East and West was related to this. I can't remember the term now. If anyone else can, please jump in. Maybe you've all heard the cliche of, God became human so that we become more God. That sort of thinking.
I'm missing something here, but when I think of Christianity, I think of, there's a line in John, Jesus says, Father, let them be one in me as I am one in you, so the world will know that you sent me. And so Jesus is wanting the oneness, people to experience the oneness with God, to experience, therefore, the divine of God. That's his prayer in that. I'm taking it. Is that inconsistent? I'm just not sure if I'm following the dialogue about human experiencing God, and the oneness with God and the totality of God, and that's what Christ was all about. Am I missing something?
Well, I think. Go ahead.
I'll quickly say, I marvel that there are at least 4 canonized testimonies, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And John has been thought of by many as outside of the synoptic, single-eyed view of Matthew, Mark, and Luke because of its more mystical interpretation, if you will. And then there's the whole Gnostic tradition that never made it into the formal canon as we know it. I think those traditions, in my awareness, reach toward what you're speaking of, David. There's a greater appreciation for this possibility of our union with God. And John is very, very explicit about it.
Yeah, well, Eckhart in his sermons has said that we're all sons of God, and that's they were the Jesuits or whomever were he was going to be excommunicated for expressing this, and I think there's a strong, I guess, Catholic or tradition that's heresy to say that we're sons of God, or at least back then it was. So I think that's a lot of people that felt that they probably kept quiet about that because that was considered heretical. That's my understanding.
Now, I am not claiming to know the context of this totally, but there's a verse in John 10 where the Pharisees were after Jesus for something he had done that was like blasphemy. And Jesus says that, I've done these good works and you're going to stone me for it. The Jews answered, it is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, though only a human being, are making yourself God. Jesus answered, is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? I don't know the context of that, but someplace in there it says you are gods, and then Jesus is trying to make himself equal with God, and they don't like that.
So they stone him.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what fascinates me about what you just read, or one of the things, going back to Jung's archetypes and the serpent and I'm endlessly fascinated by Jung's somehow bringing all the polarities of good and evil. Well, it comes through in Job, right? God is all, encompasses. These archetypes don't just speak to our good, our best selves, our most loving selves, right? The archetypes also speak to the shadows, the dangers that we have within us. And that too is somehow sacred, if you will. I'm not sure that's the right word to use, but in our seeking to be like God, are we able to claim that within ourselves that causes the most animosity, hardship, wrong? I want to listen to my therapy friends here on the screen to hear. I find it fascinating and troublesome and a lifelong journey to bring together within myself that all of this is somehow of God.
Well, one thing about that, there's a serious meditation teacher, and I can't remember whether it's Adyashanti or Eckhart Tolle, but they speak of the two dimensions, the horizontal being the human and the vertical being the spiritual, the being, and that we are a human being. And so the human dimension is what becomes conditioned by society and by everything since, probably before we were born. Whereas the being is a spiritual dimension that is not polluted. And so they, both, and I forget which one of them speaks in these terms, but that's, they speak of these two dimensions within all of us. So we have the human, which I don't know what Jung would call that, but it's the conditioned consciousness, and the spiritual, which is the being, which is essentially pure awareness, or just the essence, or the divine.
Ontario, were you going to comment?
Well, there's a lot here to say something on. I think a basic experience everybody has as base material to work with is owning and encountering our own shadow. The interplay between our consciousness and our shadow generates this kind of oppositional tension that if we can bear it and be humbled by it, it can generate this third thing. And in general, whenever you encounter symbolic or numinous energy, it comes out in a pair of opposites. And the psychological growth has a lot to do with being able to tolerate the tension between holding those opposites. And then the third thing, this divine child, this thing that you couldn't have imagined, has a chance to emerge. The new creation can come through.
What is meant by the shadow?
Well, it's a very basic concept about all of our unfulfilled life, all the things that we feel guilt and shame about, all the things that we would rather not other people not know about us. But it's not always bad stuff. Jung commented that whatever gets put in the shadow is in what your consciousness. So you might have a hardened sociopathic criminal who has a shadow that's full of light and peace and harmony because that person has never lived it. So that's their work to deal with their shadow. But for most of us, we have pieces of our shadow that we only meet in projection. We meet it through the people that get our ire up, or that we hold contempt for, or we fear, or we admire, we envy. Then we experience our shadow in a projected state. So psychological growth means eating the shadow, taking that in, owning our own shadow. It's just what Jung is saying in here, of owning our own piece that we are wanting others to carry for us.
Thank you.
This is there's so much in this chapter and these readings, and I guess it's, I'm trying to remember now, is it in the Secundus or in the end of the beginning piece of these opposites coming together, of Jung understanding and seeing these things you were just talking about, Don, and that this kind of wholeness, this awakening, this understanding comes from getting in touch with, like in Buddhist terms, getting in touch with our suffering, understanding where the suffering is coming from so that we can find our way through to transforming that suffering. So we get in touch with the shadow so that we can become whole and come up into this third thing that you speak of. And to speak to what Don DAWN said earlier, it's like, yes, it is, in my mind, it is sacred. I mean, if God, if they did create everything, then they created that too. And that is, it's a sacred piece because it's what brings us into individuation, into wholeness, into this new life of being a complete and whole human being. You know, we need to touch it and be with it. It's a part of us. You know, to keep it separate is what causes us problems. So it's kind of like our relationship to it, for me anyway, is helpful when I don't demonize myself, when I don't demonize who I am, when I see all that, the shadow stuff or the negativity. And the more I can touch it and be with it and figure out how to allow it to dissolve or transform it, then I become this other person. And I wouldn't be that other person without that. So yeah, it's and that's how I kind of think about it and talk about it.
To go back to the red book for a moment, I was looking in that chapter on the castle in the forest, and I was really struck by the tension that was being felt around the fear of banality that he's expressing. You know, that he suddenly feels that he's not sure, again, if it's real or not, just as previously he was questioning whether Elijah and Salome were real. Now he encounters the old scholar and his daughter, and he he's afraid that he's just making this up, and he's in some kind of cheap romance that he always loathed. And then there's this exchange around banality, and I think that it relates a little bit to what we were saying, that banality is just the given of our existence. Yes, I didn't know if Rodney was saying something. So anyway, I just wanted to go there and maybe explore a little bit more, if anyone else had anything to say about that next chapter.
I love that too, Lisa, and also the connection with the feminine, the banal and the feminine are so, tightly tied together for him, and in my mind, that's sort of the details of life, the details of the way we go about our days and the way we spend our minutes, and and also that his shadow material is, it's the banal, the feminine, joy. Those sorts of things that fascinates me too. That's what disgusts him. That's what, brings out the shame and the scorn in him. And to watch him sort of work through that, the patriarch in him. And there's, I can't remember exactly which chapter it is, but you see him go, get into his anti-Semitism and racism, but he's doing it in this very conscious way, where he's really getting in there and bringing those things to consciousness.
And on page 225, it comes again to a profession of love, where she asks, "Do you love me?" And he says, "By God, I love you, but unfortunately, I'm already married." And then, so you see, even banal reality is a redeemer. I thank you, dear friend, and I bring you greetings from Salome. So just as Jo Marie was saying, from the feminine, again, this other that he is so quick to dismiss, but works his way through coming to even love the feminine. And the relatedness, I think that where we had noted earlier that the feminine is seen as something in relation with, and of course in certain frames of masculinity, that relatedness is could be seen as a form of dependence and therefore weakness.
Thank you for that. And thanks for pointing out the Salome. She brings greetings from Salome, because that's kind of another form that his soul is taking, right? It goes from the child to Salome to this banal feminine. And wrote down a quote, and I can't find the page. I think it might be on 232, but from the Castle in the Forest chapter, where he says, "The soul demands your folly, not your wisdom."
It's at the end of the first paragraph on 230.
Thank you. Did you write that one down too?
Underlined it.
And there's a similar image on 219 about the devil this time. He says, the devil always seeks to saw off the branch on which you sit. Kind of sort of these challenges that are sprinkled through here. Anything else bubbling up for anyone?
This would be more of a question for the analysts. Towards the end of the chapter, Castle in the Forest, page 231, he goes into talking quite a bit about hell and one's own particular hell. Everything odious and disgusting is your own particular hell. How can it be otherwise? Every other hell was at least worth seeing or full of fun, but that never is hell. Your hell is made up of all the things you've always ejected from your sanctuary with a curse and a kick of a foot. So to me, that sounds like what Don was saying earlier about the unconscious. Is that, what would you?
Yeah, I would say owning your own shadow and working with it is like being in what he's talking about. Hell here, this thing you'd like to get rid of. You don't want to, you want to disown it. You don't want it associated with you. It's horrifying.
Oh, thank you. So would the shadow is part of the unconscious, or it's all of the unconscious? I mean, are they synonymous? I guess that's what I'm asking in the terms that you're using.
Well, just like the unconscious, the shadow has levels. Unconscious, in Jung's view, has a personal portion that's more individual, our personal unconscious, our forgotten stuff, and the stuff that has influenced us that we aren't conscious of. And then there's a group unconsciousness of our family or tribe. And then there's this big idea of the collective unconscious, which is this transpersonal, infinite web of energies that influence all human consciousness from all of history. So it's the entire history of the human race that we all carry around with us a little bit. So if you think of the shadow, it's the same kind of thing. We each have a personal shadow, but then there's a group shadow. If you think about a national shadow, for example, or a shadow of an organization. And then we have this idea of the huge shadow that might be equivalent to the collective unconscious of what evil might be, or the opposite of good. Yeah, there's different levels of both of the concepts, and they're sort of parallel. Does that help?
Yes. Although maybe this is for another time, the relationship between the two, I can explore that further on my own. If you don't have a ready answer, it's probably not.
Well, the shadow is a piece of unconsciousness, but it's more accessible, at least the personal part of it's more accessible to us. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Don, would you say that is the shadow material, could it be, or would you say that it's more actively repressed? Like maybe more accessible because it's like closer to the surface, but we're actively repressing it, whereas there's so much of the unconscious that maybe we're not active. It feels like the unconscious is so much bigger than the shadow, or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, the shadow is usually one of the first places we encounter the unconscious. That's how people have a personal experience of the unconscious. You know, the devil made me do it. I don't know what I was thinking. You wake up in the other room and you don't know how you got there. These are all kinds of examples of sort of unconscious activity, particularly if it's nefarious stuff. that you don't know quite what made you do things. Well, that's the shadow. And if you own that stuff and start looking at the underlying reasons for it or the history of it, then you're doing psychological work. And we do that lifelong. I mean, that's a lifelong process. We're never done with it.
Well, yeah, can I add something here or ask a question? Yeah, in the Jung sections that we read, I think somewhere he talked about eros versus logos, and that I'm just wondering where eros would fall in this conscious, unconscious, whatever, as opposed to logos, because I think Jung says that the eros is something that cannot be dealt with conceptually, because it's a different thing. It's unconceptual. And does any of this ring a bell with anybody in terms of the reading we just did?
Well, because Jung was a thinking type, eros is going to be less conscious for him, more raw, more unassimilated, more that he might project as part of his shadow. So he might see it in women. He might see it in feeling, because as a thinker, he prefers that. That's the reality he prefers. So his work in the Red Book is a descent from his thinking pinnacle down into this whole real world of feeling and the feminine and emotion, where eros lives for him. Now, if you were a person who was primarily a feeling person on your consciousness, then thinking, and that may be more unconscious for you and might be closer to the shadow. So it just depends where you're starting from.
Thank you.
Well, the clock says that our time is just about gone here. Joe, Marie, did you have anything else you wanted to?
No, I don't have anything. Thank you.
So we will pick up at the end of March with the anchorite. And and Jung's meeting of the anchorite will be our first encounter with the real in March. We enlarge our experience of the Red Book by our participation here together, in our presence, in our listening, in our speaking. So thank you to all of you, and we'll see you again in March.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jo Marie. Good night.